Good morning, everyone.
Good
Thanks
morning.
for joining us on our panel today, and thanks for joining us in person and online. This is a conversation that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm just curious, how many of you in the room are in a stage of growth? Anybody? Yeah, okay. How many of you have a senior HR or people leader today on staff? Okay, several of you. Good, great. So if you've already made the decision, you know how important having the right person at your back is as you try to grow a successful business and take your ideas and turn them into reality, right? And today, to help us talk a little bit about how important this is and how this is actually evolving, especially over the last several years, we have a few wonderful panelists. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves because I didn't print off each of your bios. Lisa, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm the VP of People at TeamPay. We're a Series B fintech platform based in New York. I'm a native Bostonian and work remotely from here. And I've been leading the people function at Series B and Series C startups for the past 7 years or so. And prior to that, had been at McKinsey and PwC in both HR and recruiting.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. Christina?
Hi, I'm Christina Laconi. I'm the Chief People Officer at Rapid7. We're a publicly traded cybersecurity company headquartered in Boston. I joined when we were 75 people, almost 13 years ago, which if you knew me, you'd laugh in my face because I consider myself a startup junkie. It's the 6th time I've done one. But I guess I'm pretty passionate about building from scratch and then scaling with soul. So that's why I've stuck around so long and happy to talk more about it.
Happy to learn some of what you've learned along the way. Roxanne, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a people leader. I'm a CEO of a Series B company as well, Athena, but we get to serve people leaders. I have on my name tag, talk to me about compliance that doesn't suck because we do HR compliance, whether it's employee hotline or training. I have a really wonderful head of people, and she kind of showed me the light in terms of historically my background. I was an Army officer for a bunch of years, and then I was at McKinsey for a minute. And did not, I had a little bit more Toby than Guiding Star there. And so I got to really see what a phenomenal people leader can do from the CEO co-founder perspective. And so excited to chat with y'all.
Yeah, great to have this really broad experience on the panel. For myself, I'm the head of strategy and principal analyst at a boutique research firm called Aptitude. We're actually based here in Boston as well. And I have spent probably about 14 years studying innovation cycles in the world of HR and technology. We all know the last couple of years have been absolutely insane in that space. So the lens I'm looking through is helping us define some best practices. I've actually worked at a Series B2C startup based out of London as well called Beamery. They were really fun years. I don't know why anybody would do it again, but it's crazy out there. All right, well, so the first question that we have up today is people, ops, HR, human capital management. Does it matter what we call this thing? And maybe we can talk a little bit about how it's evolved. Maybe that's why we're wondering what to call this thing. And so, Lisa, we'll start with you. What's your take?
Sure. I think, look, what ultimately matters is how we're supporting our employees and leaders. The nomenclature isn't as critical, but I do think HR has more of a connotation of like being the old school paper pushers, only doing terminations and hiring. I do think the people ops umbrella enables us to fold more into the tent and become a little bit more inclusive. I think even just having the name operations as part of the function, I think gives us as a function more legitimacy at the executive table.
It almost like represents just how much real work there is too, right? It is operational. It's not a matter of just policy policing. There's a lot of day to day. Christina, what's your experience been?
I've been at this a long time. So I think when I say a lot of controversial stuff, so I apologize up front. I started and I was the kid who got out of college and said, why the heck do we call it human resources? If we're trying to scale a business, if we think of people as a resource, we're totally missing the point, right? And so names actually do matter to me. So I sort of rebranded what I did as only the arrogance of youth can do in my mid-20s and said, I'm not HR, I'm people strategy. And we sort of built around that. And for me, that became really clear about if you have a business strategy, the people strategy is the strategic piece that helps figure out how do you move all the humans to execute against that business strategy. That's not rocket science, but everyone does it really differently, right?
Mm.
And I looked to today, and I think some of the words actually do matter, right? Because, you know, my title might be Chief People Officer. For me, that's all encompassing. Some people are CHRO. Some people are VP of People Ops, whatever you want to call it. But I look at People Ops, and I think that's very operational. I don't hear strategic in there. Now, there could be. It's totally the way you play the role.
Hmm.
But I think intentionality up front and what you're signaling to the business, like if you're a VP of People Operations and you report to the CFO, that is a very different execution of the people function than if you are something called something different and you're reporting to the CEO. And I'm not making judgment calls on which makes sense for your
Right. Either
business.
one could
I'm
make
just
sense, right?
saying, I'm just saying, I think it matters.
Yeah, certainly. And Roxanne, you recently have hired your HR or people leader, right? What's
People.
people? Yeah. So
Yeah.
what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think agree with the point that it's kind of just branding. If you just change the title, you haven't really done anything particularly profound. But I think that actually branding is incredibly powerful. We see it in startups. You have totally undifferentiated companies, but one has this really phenomenal brand and you just like it more. So I wouldn't, discount the value in the brand. And then completely agree that I think it's really more like, is it resourced? Is it considered? So for example, like when I was in the Army, I would go to HR if I wasn't getting paid correctly, if an award wasn't processed, something like that. I would never think like, wow, I'm having this really difficult interpersonal issue with, people on my team. Like, gosh, who do I go to? HR. And so I think that it is really important to, if you're trying to make that shift and you're a people leader, to explain like, here's the difference. It's not just a brand, because you might have a CEO, co-founder who has come from a world where they've only known HR. And so whether you call it people or HR, they're going to like pattern match in their head. Hey, you're the person I go to ask, for these really logistical things. Whereas I go to my COO, I go to my CFO, I go to my, sales leader, whatever, when I'm trying to build the business. And so I think it's like maybe step one is brand it correctly, but then way more important is like educate everyone you're working with about what your capabilities are. And I'm very here for controversial statements. So I'd also say you have to kind of earn it. Like if you just say like, I'm a strategic people leader,
Right.
and then I go to you and I'm like, okay, but like what the hell is going on in sales right now? And you're like, don't know, they're getting paid.
Yeah.
Like it'll completely undermine, this pitch that you've just made.
I really love that. But, if we think about the track that we're on as the founders track, I think I would love to hear from you each. Like one of the themes I just pulled out of that is it depends on how you resource it and, how empowered that function is as founders and maybe as future people leader hiring managers. I don't know how to phrase that. What are some things that they might be considering looking at if they are looking out into the world now and trying to think, what is this person going to be for me? What is this role going to be for us? And I'll throw that out to anybody.
Start. I think if you're a CEO, like you should have a perspective, right? No one's expecting you to understand the intricacies of how to do that, the people job, but you got to know what you're looking for. And I think, especially in startup communities, like there's not a lot of, I know I'm supposed to say, there's such an amazing community of people leaders. There's not. Like
No.
there's a lot of people that they're still sort of making that transition from HR to a little more strategic. And I often see CEOs say like, it's the soft stuff. So I'm going to take that, no offense to age, I was one of these people, but like a 23-year-old, because they're like, they've got an awesome personality and they'll plan a great party. If that's what you're going for, you're going to fail miserably, right? And obviously as you scale and you have money in the bank and whatever, you can afford a little more. But I think you have to you have to really do your homework and understand what you're looking for and seek it out, because I would argue if you find that right person, it could be invaluable to you as you're scaling your business.
It's really interesting, but I have a question, like a counterpoint here for any of you. Does your first HR hire need to be your chief people officer, your head of HR? Because I think we all agree that like you're saying you're not going to make judgment statements. Having a tactical HR leader at a certain point actually makes complete sense for you.
Yeah, I think when you're just getting started, like somebody's got to do benefits and like all the basic
Somebody's got to do the stuff.
Somebody's got to do the stuff. So I don't think you need a strategic person to do that. But I think as you're ramping up and scaling, that becomes incredibly more important.
Yeah.
I think you see a lot of times at Series A companies, you don't necessarily see there's a head of people. There could be like a senior manager, senior director of people. I've come into a number of companies where they've never had a head of people before. And I think that's where it's also really important to partner with the co-founders and understand even before you're hired, like what are their biggest priorities? How can you best partner with them to bring value to the business? And unfortunately, I can say I've had a few wrong turns and entered roles where I thought I was going to be, a mix of both strategic and executional, and ended up being more executional than I had realized. So I think it's for anyone who is considering the people leader route, I think it's really important to get those questions right in the interview process.
Yeah, I had a very I think typical founder mindset toward titles early on, where it's like, I don't know, what do you want to be called? Like head of, and I feel like the head of title can kind of hide a multitude of sins because it really means you don't totally know what you're looking for. But on the flip side, I think it can work phenomenally well if you have someone who can kind of stretch a couple of levels. But it really is a bit more rare than I wish it was. So we hired this phenomenal person, Melanie Naranjo, who I strongly recommend you follow on LinkedIn because her stuff is fire. And she kind of came in and was like, wow, like a bunch of logistical things are a mess. So I'm going to clean those up first. But then she was able to keep scaling and do things like training for our managers or really partner on some tough stuff. And so she kind of spanned, I would say, a couple of different roles. Like the stuff she was doing early on was really more of a junior employee, just putting systems in place. But she prioritized it correctly, which as a founder, I super appreciated, because one of the more annoying things you can kind of hear is I'm strategic. You're like, well, I just did plumbing last week, so I'm going to need you to get your hands dirty a little bit too. So I think if you're a people leader coming into a Series A or Series B startup, I think you'll gain a lot of trust if you do sort of the drudgery work, the Toby work, for lack of a better term, as long as you make sure that you're not pigeonholed into just that, and you recognize that it is super important that people get paid, that compliance is done, all of that. That's not, a given, but just don't get stuck, kind of like you were saying, where you can't get to that next level.
I really like that. And it actually segues into our next question, because I feel like what you're describing, and maybe both of you as practitioners will agree, you kind of want to put your fingerprints on the operations that you're taking over too. So getting into the stuff actually is helpful. You need to have street cred, right? But how has the stuff changed? We all know we've been through a few chaotic years. We kind of forget that it was really chaotic going into 2020 as well. I think Gallup actually reported that we had record high burnout in the workforce going in. So it's not like things just got tough recently. So how has the people function evolved? What is the scope of this role today? And I think we've gotten a good sense of the importance of finding the right person, but why might founders prioritize this kind of hire and at this point? And I'm actually going to start with you, Christina.
It's changed a ton, right? So I love just calling out. I'm old. I've been doing this a long time. So when I started my career, personnel was ending, which is super old school, right? Files. And then it went to HR, and that was supposed to be super strategic. And, it probably was for 20 years. And now we've shifted again. I look at 2020, and as somebody who's been in startups my whole career, 2020 was my favorite year of my career. And I know that makes me sound like I should be committed somewhere, but it forced me to do my job differently, right? It put everything into question. Andrew knows this. We were working together when it was happening and trying to figure out how to engage people. We were a 5-day-a-week in the office company. How do you keep people engaged? How do you keep people motivated when they're trying to deal with their own life stuff? And the one thing we all had in common, other than trying to stay healthy, was we all had something going on in our lives, whether it's tiny children or, loneliness or whatever it was.
Or 4 roommates that are all competing for Wi-Fi.
Crazy. Yeah, exactly. But trying to figure out how to inspire and motivate became really important. And I think no one had answers. So it became this really interesting point in time where people leaders could make a name for themselves if they chose to lean in on that, because no one had answers. And CEOs were looking to them to say, what the heck do we do? And, we saw some really interesting people kind of rise up through that point in time because they were getting really creative or doing what made sense for their company. I think the thing that tells me we're not quite there yet is the crowdsourcing that goes on. I'm a big fan of sharing ideas, but what works for your company may not work for mine and vice versa, right? So if I just say, what did you do? and then I try to adopt it. If it doesn't work for our, like, authenticity matters. And I think there's a lot of, I don't have the answer, I'm going to look to my peers to see what I can steal from them, is great in theory, but you got to adapt it to make it work for your own environment.
It's kind of interesting. I don't know how you feel about this, Lisa. I haven't seen HR. I have seen this function struggle with change management in the past, and we kind of had this forced change exercise, right? And so I don't know. Do you feel like it brought out new strengths? If it did, it test, foundational pieces. Do you agree that it was completely new for you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think 2020 was a big inflection point. It was actually my first people leader role. And I kind of view myself as like the chief problem solver because we were figuring out, health policy in terms of return to office, how to ensure everyone's comfortable and also supported from a mental health standpoint. And then I also think a key role I played at that time was almost like chief internal communications officer. Usually at Series B and Series C startups, there aren't always internal comms folks. And I wore that hat at Alice, my company at the time, and worked very much in lockstep with the founders in terms of what messages we wanted to share around Black Lives Matter, or we did a huge reduction in force because we had to preserve runway for our company. And I think by showing my value in a different way outside of like standard like benefits compliance, I was able to show that like, yes, I deserve a seat at this table and I'm pivotal in helping the company get through COVID. And then we actually were acquired shortly thereafter and helping us get through that process too.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, a lot more than paper pushing, like you said, right? I think the internal comms piece is pretty critical because there was just so much uncertainty. And people always give us flack if we're not communicating down, right? If people don't know what's going on. But especially then, you have this really fine balance of over communicating and not communicating enough. And navigating that is really challenging. Roxanne, what was your experience during COVID? And how have you seen maybe the role of this? Has this role, the scope of this role changed for you, your perspective of it?
Totally. I was just sad because I was pregnant and like we were raising our Series A. Like what happened during COVID? So we work with a ton of people leaders primarily at tech companies. And so it was really fascinating maybe to take a perspective more of a person who is selling to them, who's working with them as our customers. And like a couple of things you just mentioned, RIFs, return to work, Black Lives Matter, like just recognition of employee engagement and that being really different. So what we saw is like internal comms went from this thing where it's like, I don't know, you send out a massive BCC email with like our stance on this recent social issue to like, oh, employees are leaving because a CEO really botched, whether it was a firing, whether it was, an employee who acted inappropriately. Like, so it went from this almost kind of like, I don't know, just PR can kind of cover it up type of things. So like these are actual mission critical things that kind of change the trajectory of tech companies in particular. And so we were working with a lot of people leaders who like almost took stock of like, what are all the things we're doing just because we're supposed to do them? And is there any way to do them like more strategically? Compliance training is like a phenomenal example of this, right? Like once a year you tell your company not to harass everybody and you're like, okay, we did it. And then it's like, oh, interesting. This is kind of like deeply related to some of the issues that are going on in the world, in tech, employees feeling like they're not valued. I think there's just so many different rises of people recognizing that there are a lot of people at your company, but not all of them feel like their voices have been equally heard for years. So it was really neat to see people leaders kind of, I'll just give like one example. We do training in microlearning, so you can send it out whenever. And so some of our customers started coming to us and being like, hey, it's Pride Month. Can we like send a little, micro learning on gender identity? Because turns out everyone's really confused about when to use pronouns, how to use pronouns. Everyone's terrified. We don't know what to do. It was like, what a phenomenal way to take something that historically was personnel, HR, like make sure you check a box and make it something that's like bringing people together, having a conversation. So I thought that was a really good example of both being strategic, but also kind of taking a less is more, or like, how can you do more with less, right? You don't necessarily always have to bring in 10 consultants and do this whole thing. It was like people leaders being problem solvers and just kind of asking from first principles.
Can I add one piece to that?
Of course.
One thing that I think was great about the pandemic is that it put people in our roles in a position of like, show me what you got, right? And that plays well for a lot of people. I think in some cases we overcorrected in the world. This is where I'm going to get a little controversial. I apologize ahead of time. But like a lot of companies said, what do you want, people? Do you want to go back to the office or not? Well, if I'm 25 and somebody's asking me what I want to do, I want to stay wearing my sweatpants and not have to commute. But what I'm not thinking about is who am I going to learn from? How am I going to develop? Who's going to take bets on me? And I'm not suggesting that we should ever go, the world will never go back, I don't think, to there. But I think we leaned so heavily into what do our people want because we were terrified of them leaving. We were also hearing at the same time there's a war for talent. People were leaving across the street. If you're not engaged and you're online, guess what? You're going to take the highest paycheck because you don't necessarily feel affinity to your company. So I think that it becomes incredibly important for that people leader to partner with the CEO. Like, you still have a business to run. So I love people, but if you're hiring somebody and the first thing, why do you want to play this role? I love people. Goodbye. Like, that's not the person you should hire. I love people, but you're looking for somebody who's a business thinker, who's trying to take the human elements and make them work for the business, not just create this like kumbaya scenario where everybody feels super special. Like, that's important, but you got to balance it with, like, you still have a business to run. And we've watched a lot of businesses end up having rifts and all kinds of stuff. I mean, the economy has not been phenomenal over the last couple of years either, but I think you got to balance it.
Yeah, I mean, that is a pretty hot take, but there's so much wisdom in it, especially Roxanne, I think you were bringing this up. During those 2 years, we'll call it, there was a level of just hyper reactivity in the social sphere. And it was no longer enough for CEOs, executives, especially in tech, to sit on the sideline. They wanted, like, employees wanted people to be activists.
Absolutely.
And that's reactive. I mean, the CEO I was working with at the time was a very private person and did not want to step forward. And I think that if you have the wrong people leader in place that is focused too heavily on the people aspect, you're just going to become a ping pong ball, right? And just get whacked around everywhere. It's really insightful.
Yeah, I think just like as I totally agree. Don't think it's or I think it's unfortunately a hot take, but empathy and accountability are like they're both needed. And I think when we were interviewing our people leader, we were like, let's go through a mock firing. Like, we want to see how you're going to do it, not because we're like masochists or something, but because it's like this is like the worst thing that you're going to have to do. You're going to have to coach our managers to do it, and it's really important for us that it's both done because like performance management is crucial, and that it's done with a level of like empathy that we think is important. But I think like empathy and accountability, one without the other is just a disaster. And I totally agree that there was kind of the like yoga for dogs benefits like era sort of thing in tech that has swung completely in the other direction. And I think the companies that have done a phenomenal job navigating this are ones that have been a little bit more in the middle the whole time of like, but it's still a job,
So we just keep naturally segueing, which I always love as a moderator. But then Christina, had just said, if you're a founder and you're interviewing somebody for a chief people officer role, I actually think it's the same for anyone in HR. If they say, "Oh, I love people," you're like, that's not enough, right? You have to love the business and understand the role that people play. But so let's talk about responsibility in the role of chief people officer. What responsibility does the chief people officer have to a founder CEO? And Lisa, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the hardest pieces for me of being a head of people is accepting that my founder and I might have differences, and ultimately he's the one who makes the final decision. I view myself as like a critical counselor and advice giver, but having to know when I need to just kind of like shut up, that has been, I'd say, a delicate balancing act. But I also feel my role is to very much to protect the company, as well as being a bridge between employees and the executive team, and that it is incumbent on me to have the difficult conversations with both my founder, CEO, as well as other members of the company. And I think having staff realize, like, you're not just the people person, like, you're there to help the business advance, as I think Christina had mentioned, I think is really important.
And it's also really challenging, I have to imagine, too. I mean, finding the balance between, I think you said accountability and empathy. Oh my goodness. I mean, you want to be that connection point between the employee experience and the executive strategy, but that puts you between a rock and a hard place all the time. How are we navigating that? And I'm going to come over to Christina. I'm sorry, yeah, Christina for that one.
How do I navigate that?
Yeah,
I don't
give us
know.
that hot take again.
I don't know. It's just what I do, right?
Mm.
I mean, I think I've been doing it so long. I take it for granted. But I think, when I started at this company, I've had a really weird career. Like I have been in the first person in a people team since I was 25. So my first
Yeah.
job, I was in a team. And then by the time I was 25, I'm like, I think I know enough that I could go lead this by myself, like only an idiot, with no experience could do. But it was a company that was high, fast growing, and a bunch of other 25-year-olds running it, which is very common in today's world. In the late 90s, it was not. But we took it public, and we clearly knew we knew a little more than we thought we did. So I've always been sort of the first person in, and then scaled. So my job has completely changed in the 13 years I've been at Rapid7, where I used to do benefits administration the day I started. And now, I think my job is more like Wendy Rhodes on Billions, if you've seen that, right? I mean, I spend much of my time, I've got an amazing team, but I spend most of my time with the CEO or the leadership team, sort of coaching how they should be running their team. So it's a completely different job, which is really cool to be at the same place and be able to do that. But I think one of the things that makes me good at it, if I'm good, is to balance that empathy. Like, we do have to be empathetic, and I am not suggesting at all I don't love people. I do. I'm just saying that's not what people should lead with. But that balancing that empathy with trying to understand where the business is trying to go, and then try to constantly be translating that to our people to help them to understand why this is important, why it's not all about you. And I'm sorry, Andrew, you've been hearing me say this for years, but like that balance of me and we is really critical, right? There's definitely elements. People can go to whatever job they want to. Nobody's, indentured and has to stay there for 40 years. But you got to figure out what's going to motivate them to want to be there. But they also have to give back. It's not just all about you. And here's the yoga for your dogs, or here's what, like, obviously you have to have some things that inspire people, but they've got to give back too. And I don't think we should have to apologize for asking people to work, right? We're paying, especially in tech, I mean, we're paying people incredible amounts of money to do extraordinary things, and trying to, work with people to understand, like, hey, you know what? You working 2 hours a day is like not really working, and understand what's going on with them and have that conversation and stuff is a tough thing, but I think you're pretty good at it if you can balance that transition between employees and leaders.
Roxanne, you were the one that put accountability out there as something that you look for. And having just hired, it was
Melanie.
Melanie
She's been
Naranjo,
with
and
us
we
for
drive.
a year and a half. or so,
Yeah, cool. So, what do you look to hold your chief people officer accountable to?
Well, I actually think like an ideal relationship is also my people leaders like holding me accountable. I think as when you're a founder of a 2-person company, it's like you're CEO, but there's 2 people, and I think as it gets bigger, fewer and fewer people are incentivized to tell senior leadership that they're messing up. But the issue is like you're human. So you're definitely messing up. You're making a million decisions every day and you're doing your best, but you got natural biases and all just like mistakes happen. And so like, I'll just give a concrete example because perhaps that's like helpful. I think we were going through a particularly rapid time. We had shipped a bunch of new products because the economy, we realized like people are looking for one-stop shop. So we built a hotline, case management, and we were just moving really quickly. And Melanie came to me and said in a slightly better way than this, but basically like, you are making really impulsive decisions right now. Could you talk me through why you're doing that? And there's like, that could be a moment that's totally disastrous. And that's our last conversation because how dare you, challenge my authority or something like that. But she did it in a way that kind of helped me explain like, here's why I'm having this bias to action, but also let me reflect like, oh, I see how in some decisions that's very helpful and in others that can be chaotic. and it allowed us to, like, kind of to your point, it was Melanie more being a coach than anything else, which is really valuable because CEOs don't often have a lot of people who will do that to them. You might have your co-founder, you might have a couple of early employees who, you know, are very comfortable speaking truth to power, but not everybody is. And so I think that building that muscle of having like a very scary conversation where you're giving constructive feedback up is just like so important, because I think many founders are hungry for it, but they just like it's like a muscle that you don't work and it atrophies. And yeah.
But that says a lot about you as a leader too, right? It goes both ways. Like, she's gonna have the confidence to be able to say it,
Totally.
and you have to be willing to hear it.
And not
when
flip
that
the table
happens,
over.
yeah. And when that happens, that's like a unbelievable relationship, right?
Totally. And I think, like, you know, another hot take, like, I think there's certainly some like components that make this more difficult. So founders are almost always men, almost always white men. People leaders tend to be women, tend to be more people of color. And there's like, I think a bunch of things that can make that dynamic more challenging than, for example, sales, where I feel like a sales leader has no problem like
Yeah.
busting open your office and being like, I need to be paid more, 10 other people need to be paid
Yeah.
more, and, you know, whatever. And that historically hasn't been the dynamic between people and CEOs or co-founders. But I think it's kind of a disservice to not have that creative tension, because a lot of good things come out of those conversations.
Well, Lisa, you had actually just said that you've had in the past, I mean, that was like a real wake up moment of like, maybe we don't have that dynamic for me to be successful. I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing some of what you've learned.
Yeah. Yeah, I realized this is at my prior company. I think the scope of the role wasn't what had been pitched to me in the hiring process.
That
and,
never happens in startup
never,
land.
ever. And I was, you know, doing my part, like, you know, I think it was Roxanne who said it earlier, like, you know, you're going to do the tactical things and like prove yourself and continue to grow. But it became clear to me that in the role I was in, the founders cared mostly about office management and recruiting. The people ops end of the house was not as critical to them. And that's, you know, totally their call. And I just realized we weren't going to meet in the middle. And we had some really open and I'd say radical candor conversations about, you know, what I was hoping to do and where they were looking to go. And ultimately I decided to move on. And you don't want to, no one ever wants to be in that place. But I think you have to be honest with yourself in terms of what you want for your career, and also try to see if there's a path forward where you are. And if there's not, there's lots of other opportunities in the world. But yeah, one of the other pieces I was going to echo or add on top of what Roxanne said is, I think having that trust built with your CEO or co-founder enables you to have the difficult conversations. I think it's harder to per se have them on day one. I think, you know, by day 60, day 90, you're usually more equipped to have them. But the other piece too to think about in this hybrid remote world we're in is, how does your CEO or founder like to be communicated with? I've adapted my style based on the founders that I'm partnering with. Some only want to have a phone call, others only want to speak via Slack. And I've had to kind of figure out what the best way is to influence them. And a lot of that is what messaging channel I'm using. So I think, and that's not something I would have thought as much about when we were back in the office, you know, 5 days a week.
Yeah, really interesting there too. I mean, the dynamics sounds like this entire panel is all about finding a balancing act. But I'm curious, how does the role of the founder or CEO, because founder could be chief technology officer, chief product officer, whatever, how does the role of that founder evolve? If we've talked a lot about the role of the HR leader, the people leader, but what about when the business leader has found that partner? You know, what does having the right partner enable them to do? And Christina, I see you nodding. Maybe I'll come to you, or?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've had a really weird career. Like, I have been in situations where twice I've been put in the position by the board to ask if the CEO was scaling, and we've ousted the CEO. Like, that's a really crappy position to be in, to be like, here's somebody that I've been supporting and adore and whatever. And yeah, I think we might be at that stage. That happens with startups. The people that join you at 10 people are not always the ones that are with you at 250 or whatever. We all know that. But I think to be able to have the wherewithal to just be, I love your accountability and empathy. I think that's the balance constantly, right? Which is nothing was worse than in 2011 or 12 when our board said, we think that we're going to bet on the guy who's now our CEO. We think people will follow him more. That company we have a better chance with him. Do you agree? To be honest about that is a really difficult thing to do. But then we did it, and it was a really good bet. He's been extraordinary. But my job became, how do I make him successful? The element that I can do. Obviously, I'm not going to write the product roadmap, but to be the person, you're absolutely right. Like I know this silly phrase, it's lonely at the top. But CEOs have a really difficult time being vulnerable to say, I'm not sure if this is going to work, or how should I think about it? To have that dynamic, all right, here's another hot take. Like you're right. There's like a lot of men in the CEO roles, and a lot of the
It's
people.
an ice cold take.
I think the
unfortunately.
fact that I am a woman in this role has been a massive advantage. A massive advantage. I have found, sorry, men, that men will probably not be as vulnerable with other men
How dare
as
you?
they would be with me. And some of that is like the space that I create, and they know I'm not going to judge, and I'm just there to make them successful. But I found that vulnerability, how to use that to my advantage as a woman, rather than like, oh, I'm a woman. But I think there's all kinds of things that you can lean into, but I think it's just, you gotta, the one other piece that I would add to this conversation though is, when you're starting out, you're taking jobs, right? You just need experience. You want to get your feet wet. You got to pay your dues and learn the skills. But as you advance, if you believe you are good, if there's indications that you're good at this work, you should be making choices about whether or not that CEO is right for you. You sound terrific. You sound, no, seriously, like you sound open-minded and somebody that would be amazing to partner with, right? Not all CEOs are like that.
Yeah.
And I'm at the point now where I'm like, there's probably 3 CEOs I'd work for in the city of Boston.
Yep.
And I don't mean that to sound arrogant. I'm just like, who am I going to spend my time?
Because it's not worth it.
It's
Yeah.
not worth it. And I think you have to know what, like your value and who you can make successful, or help make successful. Just as much as, hey, it's a sexy company and I'm
Right.
going to be paid well.
I'm gonna get
It's
paid.
so much
Yeah.
more than that.
Well, Roxanne, I agree that you seem like a really awesome CEO to work for, but I think you also have
All
maybe
for
some
fun.
advantage. Your clients are like HR and people leaders, right? So you are in order to be successful, you have to be able to have empathy and connection with them. But how has your role changed in the last year and a half? Are you feeling like you can breathe better because you've got somebody covering this, or are you being challenged to think
It's always
differently
hard.
about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Christina's point on CEOs like not always being able to scale at every point at every level is really important. It's something my co-founder and I both have talked to our whole team about. Like, we founded this company, we want to always do what's best for it, and that at some point might mean that we're not the right leaders, or we're not the right leader in this position. It's a really uncomfortable thing to say, but I think it's very important for leaders to say it, because then when you tell other people at your company, hey, you did a phenomenal job taking us from 1 to 2, but man, like, this isn't going to work for the next step. You're not being hypocritical, because you're holding yourself to those same standards of like, not everyone is good at every stage. And I think for a founder in particular, it's super hard. The things I had to do to take the company from nothing to, like, we sold Netflix in our first year, and it was like phenomenal. It was so exciting, but it was like the, most scrappy, like you're just kind of like making up and figuring out and all that. And the things you do to do that are really different than the things you do to like serve your nth public company over and over. And it's just a totally different skill set. So I think being really honest with yourself and with your whole team that like everyone is being held to the same accountability standard is important. I also wanted to make a point on Christina's like, not every leader is right for you. Our phenomenal head of people is doing a webinar later this month. It's something like leadership might be the problem, because I think so many people leaders feel like they're put in these positions where they have to defend actions they just like fundamentally don't agree with. And it's really, really hard. And I think at a certain point, it's okay to either say, look, I need a job right now, and this is my job, and like, here we are. Or to say like, this is actually not, what I want to do. And then on the accountability and empathy point, we were being asked so much about like management training, especially around like layoffs and all of that. And so we actually created free training that you can just sign up for online and share it with your whole company. And it's on this like empathy and accountability and how managers balance it. And I think, to tie a bow on it, like to the extent that I am like a good leader to work for, I think it's because I spent my first 7 years or so in the Army, where I was just told it's not about me. Like, the best leaders here aren't here anymore. Like, you are not like hot shit, and all of that, and just got that really beaten into me, and saw what really great leadership looks like on a much more challenging scale than candidly what tech is. It's like not life or death. And so I think that just like kind of, I don't know, kickstarted a level of humility that I try to put into the whole company, because I think it just makes everything a little bit less like personal and stingy. If you can be like, look, we're all just trying our best, but sometimes like, here's the report card and it's just not working out.
Yeah, I really like it. I'm doing a quick time check. We've got 15 minutes left before we wrap up. I've got a couple of other questions here, but those of you who have joined us in person and those of us who are online, if you have a question or something's kind of stewing up a little bit, if you want to take a minute to just think about what you might ask, go for it. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up. Sound good? Okay. All right, so the next question is a little bit of a pivot, and it's nothing that we discussed in our pre-call, but it is, again, I live in studying HR tech. It's something that's coming up a lot for me and for my clients. Innovation cycles are getting tighter and tighter, actually out of control if you look at AI. And there are a lot of questions about Gen AI powered coding, people writing code through Gen AI, or automated employment decision-making tools, which are heavily regulated in New York without any real clear regulation. What does the role of HR become? Like, are we getting questions from, like, I have one client who does conversational AI for candidate experience, and their buyer works for a music company, production label, and their compliance officer wanted them to ask the Gen AI to provide every piece of data that was processed to teach the AI to make sure that none of it was copyrighted, so that none of the conversational generated stuff was copyrighted at all, because there's, and so suddenly like the buyer had to become a like IP expert, just to buy a chatbot for their career website. So we know it's already coming really quickly, and I don't know if you guys are getting questions about coding or anything like that, but just kind of curious, like, how are we thinking about this disruption for our function? Lisa, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I view it as a value add with moderation, like anything. I think, look, I've used AI, I've typed in OpenAI to say, how would you have a difficult conversation with a manager about how to have a layoff, just to see what it would generate. And it's really impressive. And yes, you need to make tweaks based on what the ethos is at your company. But I think as people professionals, we can use it to help make our jobs more efficient. I don't think it means that a chatbot is going to replace a head of people. I still think, we have a huge internal wiki at our company. No matter how many times we direct employees to say, you can find the answer on the internal wiki, the number of times they come to me or another member of our team over Slack and say, where can I find this? And so I think that in of itself demonstrates like technology can help empower us, but it's not, I don't think it's going to replace the people ops function in a substantial way.
I would agree with that. I mean, I don't think people don't look at the wiki necessarily because they're lazy, maybe some, but I think there's a need for community, right? And I think that's, I think that can companies work completely virtually and be successful? Sure, we've seen great examples of that, but I think it's really hard. If you're trying to scale a company, if I think about every startup that I've been in, there's so much community-based piece to that, to build trust, to build relationships. You're betting on each other. And that's really hard to replace with technology. So I look at AI as like a great enabler to do all the tactical crap we were talking about at the beginning. Like, great, if something can answer those easy questions, awesome, more time for us to do the more interesting work or whatever. I mean, there's
Complex
definitely a
work, for
place
sure.
it. Yeah, but like, I don't think a chatbot is gonna help you figure out how your company's gonna return to work, and maybe could give you some ideas. But I think you have to really know your company. You have to know your people. I don't think that's going away.
I would agree.
Technology.
It's like an enablement layer. What about disruption to the world of work, though? Are we like in this example, suddenly somebody trying to buy a candidate chatbot had to evaluate IP law, IP compliance, and I don't know. Are we worried about us having to answer questions about how the work gets done, or are we looking to our colleagues in IT to help us look at how to evaluate the work and see if it was produced by Gen AI or by people, or I don't know.
I mean, I'll be honest and say I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about it. I think
Yeah.
it's new. So I think
I've seen on Reddit like
I
people
think
who
we'll
have
figure it
these
out.
like
Yeah.
there's actually a whole subreddit about people who are working multiple jobs because they've automated parts of their jobs.
Yeah.
Already.
I can see that happening.
Yeah.
I think that will stabilize itself over the next couple of years. It's just new.
Yeah.
We got to figure it out.
Same as in academia.
Yeah.
Roxanne, I mean, as a solution provider in the space, but then also as an advisor to a lot of talent leaders, what's your take here?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, my co-founder's our CTO and she doesn't let me say the words AI because she's like, you don't know each other. So, which she's right. But I think like AI couldn't have done like the Melanie conversation to me about like, you're making some impulsive decisions, or it certainly couldn't have done it in a way that I would have been receptive to. And so I think that's the like part of people work that, I don't know how many years, decades, centuries away we are from that. I think that the stuff that blows my mind when we go into a company to talk about our solution, whether it's a hotline, case management, or compliance training, is there are still people leaders at phenomenal tech companies who are like downloading a CSV to figure out if Susie, who's a manager in California, got California's correct harassment prevention training. So you're like, whoa, that is a lot of time going towards something that actually has a phenomenal use case for being automated, because this is just like, you can have this is like what our tool does, plug into your HR system and automate all of those things. And so I think that it would be smart for people leaders to like kind of inventory their work and not start with the high complexity stuff like, coaching senior leaders, and instead just be like, am I doing anything that is routine and can be automated today? And start there, because I've just been shocked. I mean, another example is like employee relations issues, incredibly sensitive. They usually just live in someone's Gmail, and then that HRBP leaves after 18 months and there they go. And then you have an investigation. It's just this whole mess. And that's another example where it's like, there is a very tech forward solution to these sorts of things. So I would almost prompt people, as exciting as it is to think about, could AI ever like hire much better than a human or something, to just go to, am I doing things today that are like actually have AI use cases today, and think about.
I'm sure we'll find plenty.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what's exciting for the space. But I'm glad to hear we're not really thinking about it too much, because in the blogosphere, everything's on fire all the time, it seems like. So, all right. Well, I've got a couple more questions, like I said, but I do want to check in with the folks who made time to be here today. I have a question here in the back. We have a mic that's running around here too, so the folks online can hear us.
Want to thank you so much for sharing your insights. Very, very helpful. My name is Tony Zan. I'm organizer of a founders community, and many members in our community are first-time founders at the seed or pre-seed stage. I wonder whether you can offer up some advice to our members in terms of how they can sort of wear multiple hats. In the beginning, they don't have the luxury to have a strategic or chief people's officer, and they are acting as chief people's officer. What advice do you have for them? And also what foundation work they can do as founders, so when they have scaled up to the stage where they're going to have a chief people's officer, what they should get prepared for that? Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah, thanks. Who wants to take first stab at it?
I can take the first bit. Yeah. Which is, I actually think it's a great question, because we found that bringing on advisors is a phenomenal way to get the advice of, someone who's very experienced, but you don't have, like, if you're, seed stage, you have 4 people and you bring on a chief people officer, like that was the wrong hire. Like you do not have, a full-time employee's worth of people work. But what you can do is give equity grants to people who are in the space. And you can do this for many roles. We did it for people, we did it for sales, for marketing. And we brought on 2 folks. They're still with us, Jess Ewan and Matt Hoffman. They're really great people leaders. They have a bunch of experience. And essentially you just offer them a grant and kind of structure it as like, hey, I'd love to meet with you once a month. I'm going to bring you, whatever challenges I'm working through, maybe some ad hoc stuff. And that's a really nice way that will, it'll kind of get you, it's almost a Band-Aid solution, but it'll get you to the point where it starts to really break. And then you maybe need a junior hire, a more senior hire. but you're almost like getting the expertise and the brain power, but only in the quantity that you can really absorb, because you just can't absorb a full-time person's work when you're such a small team and you're really focused more on product. You have a there and all of it. And so I think equity advisors are a really underutilized resource that founders can do. And I think making sure to like almost build out your C-suite with equity advisors first can be a really nice way to bring in that like high-powered expertise.
Excellent idea. Anybody else?
I'd second what you've said. Oftentimes there have been HR advisors in place before I've come on board in my role. The other piece I was going to mention is I'm part of a number of people leader groups in both Boston and New York. There is a large influx of former in-house heads of people who are now doing fractional people ops work and are, whether they want more flexibility or to be able to choose what types of projects they work on. I think it's another great community of talent to tap into if you have an explicit project or scope of responsibilities that you need help with. I think it's a really another great way to find talent that's been there, done that, but you don't need in a full-time capacity.
Yeah, great.
I'll add one more bit to that, echo what you both said. And then I would think about there's getting stuff done, which you can hire an advisor, whatever, fractional people. And then there's invest in conversations. You don't even have to pay anyone. There's lots of us that are out there that'll have these conversations. Like, what should you be thinking about? Because there's the tactical stuff. How do I just need somebody to set up benefits. I need somebody to deal with performance management. And then there's the, what should I be thinking about? And finding somebody who can sit down with you. And like the first advice I ever give to a CEO when I go in, when the company's really small, is what is the ethos of this company? Who are you and who do you aspire to be as a company? And a lot of that culture work ends up getting done later on down the road. But sometimes it's too late. When you're 200 people, that ship has already sailed and it's hard to dial it back. So if I'm a CEO, not only am I worried about my product and whatever, but I'm also trying to figure out if I can envision going for a B round, a C round, whatever, what am I pitching this company as? Not what we do, but who we are. And those things make a massive amount of difference. So if you can find somebody who can challenge your thinking and help you start thinking about that stuff, I would say you would be very far ahead of the game with other founders.
Yeah, that was great. We might have time for one more question if anybody has one. Anybody online? I can't read this very well, but there are some folks there. Yeah, here in the front.
We've moved from COVID to being one of the industries with most difficulty in the last couple of years, whether it's funding or the technology is no longer relevant, or you're being swallowed up by someone else. How have you responded to the tech industry, the startups that have been really struggling in the last year or two?
And for those online, the question was, how are we responding to the folks who are being impacted by all of this disruption today?
Happy to start. I mean, so we sell into people and we sell into fast growth companies. And so, yeah, like the past 18 months felt like just about every company we serve did a RIF, and that like absolutely impacts vendors and is really challenging. I think we thought about it kind of going back to like the sort of founder questions. With like, what's your core value prop? And for us, it actually ended up being a positive, which is we realized like, oh, people no longer have great budgets. They're looking for a one-stop shop. And so we built 3 new products because we kind of said like, oh, it's sort of like go time. You either kind of get consolidated to or consolidated away from. And so it forced us to really go and talk to all of our customers and be like, what other pain points do you have that are related to what we do? And I think that that's like what startups are supposed to be all about. Like, it's not supposed to be easy. You're just like, you don't get a like infinite monopoly on whatever cool thing you've like figured out. And so, and then going back to like the culture you create, I think it actually, we were worried like, man, what's morale gonna do when times are harder? And I think it actually like energized people, because you join a startup, an early stage startup, or at least you should, because you're really excited about problem solving. And if you're really excited about just coasting and working 2 hours on multiple jobs or something, like an early stage company isn't the right place for you. And so I've actually found that over the past 18 months, it's been more exciting to be at my company. It's been more exciting to like build stuff and problem solve, while also recognizing that, yeah, macro economy has been just like brutal. I mean, no two ways about it.
I would suggest, like,